Well, here we're looking at the rest of part one of Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is, I suppose, interesting in its own right as history. And I'm certainly no historian, so I assume that everything he says is true, I guess. Although I make some claims that I'm a little skeptical about, generalizations. But chapters 3 and 4 are, yes, interesting in their own right, but as far as him making his argument, which is basically that television has so trivialized public discourse in America that serious discussion, especially political discussion, is becoming harder and harder to do. That the groundwork for that really has to be laid in some account that there was ever anything else. That is that the transition from a print-dominated culture to a television-dominated culture, that actually happened, and that there was a time when serious public discourse was more common and more possible in America. This is a very American-oriented, American context argument. And he says some interesting things that I found very interesting about colonial America and 19th century America. It's really the late 19th century that you see in the last chapter of this section, the peekaboo world. The peekaboo world that he really, really with the introduction of the telegraph, that he thinks things are to change for the worse, amazingly. But an interesting account of America. And I don't know, I mean, this is, one of the things he reminds us of is the leading politicians who basically founded this country were intellectuals, and the Federalist Papers are, by three of them, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, are an interesting, record of political philosophy in the making, politics in the making, statesmanship in the making. But 18th century America was, he really wants to emphasize the idea that colonial America and 18th century America and early 19th century America were particularly literate places. He makes some interesting claims about the early American colonists, that their literacy rates were way above the places where they came from, because they were, they weren't a cross section of the population who came over from England. Really, he's talking about the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were a particular group of people. I mean, they were religious dissidents who, basically Puritans, who wanted to. I think the dominant idea, at least what I was taught, is they wanted to find a place with more religious freedom, and that they were Protestants. Let's face it. They're Protestant Christians. And I'm not going to say anything except that there's a real history there of the importance of the written word in Protestant Christianity historically that is not part of the Catholic tradition. It's not that there's not a great intellectual Catholic tradition. Of course there is. But the translation of the Bible into the vernacular was something that was resisted not only by the Catholic Church, but by the Church of England. So the particular brand, I suppose, of Protestantism, Protestant Christianity, that the early, the so-called pilgrims, the early American, you can call them conquerors if you want, because it's kind of what they were, or pilgrims, or colonists, or settlers. I mean, politically, it really, it really depends on how you see it. But that they were particularly literate, and that they had a particular respect for the written word because they thought that it was necessary for salvation. It's oversimplifying things to say that in Catholicism, the church acts as a mediator between the individual Christian and God, and acts as a kind of a shepherd and tutor to instruct and inform the individual Christian, so that the individual Christian does not, for instance, need to do a study or intellectual sort of inquiry or meditation of their own. That's way too simple, but there is some truth to it, at least in the sense that in Protestantism, individuals reading the Bible is really incredibly central. And in Catholicism, of course, Catholics do read the Bible, but it doesn't have the same fervor as it has amongst most Protestants. Which is to say that one of the things that Postman is suggesting is that for early Americans, at least the typical sort of Puritan New England or Massachusetts American, literacy was necessary for salvation. So literacy was widespread in America from the beginning. And of course, the story is complicated. There's more to America than Massachusetts, and there are, a whole population in America who had enforced illiteracy. That is, slaves, black people in America, except for the free black people in the North and other places who did become literate. But in any case, they're very, comparatively speaking, relatively speaking, there are very high literacy rates in America. It's part of the culture, and that's not to say that, Europe was literate too, but there was more of a class society. There was no real peasantry in America. There was more. It was a more egalitarian place, and education was from the beginning. People who could read and write. You didn't have to be part, as he says, of an intellectual elite. But here he's talking about in the 19th century the importance of books, and as he points out, you have to understand that in the 19th century, there's always been writing. Not always, but for thousands and thousands of years. But the invention of the printing press changed everything, because now there was more writing, and people could afford to read things. But there was a monopoly. Print had a monopoly. That is, there was nothing else. In terms of sort of mass entertainment. So books had a place that perhaps we can't imagine now, had an importance that we can't imagine. Why it was so important to our ancestors to build libraries. It was crucial, and everyone knew it was crucial. Everybody read these works, everybody, the refined and the simple. That's a quote from somebody. Publishers were so anxious to make prospective bestsellers available, they would sometimes dispatch messengers to incoming packet boats, and within a single day set up, printed, and bound in paper covers the most recent novel by Bulwer or Dickens. I don't know who Bulwer is. I'm sorry, I'm not done a great education. Of course, Dickens being Charles Dickens. As he points out, there were no international copyright laws, so the Americans would just steal the British author's stuff, and sell it. There being no international copyright laws, pirated editions abounded with no complaint from the public or much from authors who were lionized. When Dickens visited America in 1842, his reception equaled the adulation we offer today to television stars, quarterbacks, and Michael Jackson. I can give you no conception of my welcome, Dickens wrote to a friend. There never was a king or emperor upon earth so cheered and followed by the crowds and entertained at splendid balls and dinners and waited upon by public bodies of all kinds. If I go out in a carriage, the crowd surrounds it and escorts me home. If I go to the theater, the whole house rises as one man and the timbers ring again. He was a superstar. A lot of British authors came over for speaking tours, to make money, the way that a British rock band would come over to America to make money. Oscar Wilde was a hit. People loved Oscar Wilde in America, and he was very popular here, a little later than Dickens. A Native Daughter, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, a really important book in American history, was not offered the same kind of adoring attention. And of course, in the South, had her carriage been surrounded, it would not have been for the purpose of escorting her home. It would have been the purpose of, killing her. But her Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 305,000 copies in its first year, the equivalent of 4 million in today's America, and many more today, right? Because the population has gone up quite a bit since Postman wrote this book. But he's just trying to give you a sense of just how important books were and printed matter. He talks also about the proliferation of newspapers in the 18th and 19th centuries. And people read. People still read. We read. And we don't just read things on computer screens. We read things on paper, too. You have books. I have books. Um, but none of us lived in this world. I mean, the only thing that's really comparable, and I think it is an interesting thing, is to think of the Harry Potter phenomenon of earlier in the century, when people were lining up, to buy a book. People were standing in line to be the first people because they just couldn't wait to get the next Harry Potter. So it's not as if this thing is completely dead, but the Harry Potter thing was clearly an exception. It was a notable, exceptional phenomenon, but it did happen, right? I mean, there were children and adults who wanted to read those books so badly that they stood in line overnight to get the copy. Well, if you can imagine that happening on a regular basis, I suppose. And we can imagine, books selling like Harry Potter books on a regularly. Then that's the kind of world it was. So the chapter, Typographic America, is really just to try to set the scene and to explain, what living in America in the 18th and 19th centuries, the place of print, the importance of print. And I suppose another thing that makes America a little bit unique is the written Constitution. The idea that its laws, there was no oral tradition like in England to rely upon. There was things sort of had to be made up and written down, and you just think of the power of print that he's trying to get across. You can still feel that power in the American Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights. The idea that these things, because they're written down in a certain way, they have an almost religious, sacramental quality. But he's really just setting the stage here, because I think the more important idea to his thesis is not that books were really popular or people read a lot. It's that there was something called the Typographic Mind, that because print was the dominant medium, that it affected the way people thought. It affected the way that they perceived things, and it gave us the dominant metaphors that we use to understand reality, all the sort of things that he's introduced in the first couple of chapters. So we'll take a look at that in a little more detail, the idea of the typographic mind, and that is, how did the dominance of print affect the way that people thought and the kind of discourse that they had with each other.